You know, a good reminder from Genesis chapter 1, verse 3 is God always pierces the darkness, always. And the darkness doesn't last.
And the high priest, the great high priest who is Jesus Christ, he puts his hands on your life and you take your hands off and you say, my life is surrendered for your purposes.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Downline podcast, where we hope to help Christ followers faithfully walk with Jesus while pouring their lives into others. I'm Jamie Trussell, the privilege of serving as the lead pastor at Redeemer Dripping Springs in the Austin area, and to continue serving on the staff of Downline Ministries, which I certainly love, the mission and vision of restoring biblical discipleship in and through the local church. Joined today by Autumn Higashi, who I think is going to bring a really fun conversation and pertinent conversation to where our culture's at, especially as we want to contend faithfully for walking with Jesus. Autumn, say hello to our listeners and tell them a little bit about yourself.
Thanks for having me, first of all. I am so excited to be here. I got involved in the pro-life movement when I was really young. I was about 16 years old. And since then, it's just kind of been my heart. It's what I did for my whole career and what I worked for. I'm now a mom at home, but kind of still doing this as just my passion and my heart. I think it's one of those things that I don't work for an organization full-time anymore, but the pro-life movement is something that will always be a part of my life. It'll be something that I'm always finding ways to get involved and to educate people on and just to connect people, to have good conversations and hopefully change hearts and minds about abortion. But like I said, I got involved when I was really young. So I was 16 years old. I grew up in a Christian home and I knew that I was pro-life. It was something that we talked about as a family, but it wasn't ever something that I was actively involved in until I saw a post on my Facebook from Teen Vogue, which is a fashion magazine, and it was titled, "What to Get a Friend Post-Abortion." And I just remember being appalled that this was something, first of all, that a fashion magazine would even be covering. It doesn't seem to relate at all to what their niche would be. But after reading the article, I was just heartbroken that that was the message that girls my age were hearing. And I think it was the first time I realized that there really is a target on young people from the abortion industry. It was not just information on abortion. It was pure advocacy, desensitization, and normalization of abortion to make sure that young girls not only thought it was fine, but wanted to support it. So I sat down and I wrote a 10-minute response video and reached out to an organization called Students for Life and asked if they wanted to share it. And it's funny looking back now because I really had no expectation for that video. You know, I remember thinking if only a couple girls my age saw this and knew that they weren't alone in their beliefs, then that was enough for me. And then I went to check on the video after they had posted it. And I remember scrolling down and seeing my face on their Facebook page, Students for Life, and they chose the caption, "This is Autumn. She is Planned Parenthood's worst nightmare."
Oh my goodness.
And I just remember kind of being shocked by that title, and it just felt like such a badge of honor that I didn't even know I had. And then I looked down and the corner of the video was 200,000 views within a few hours. By the end of the week, there were several million. And it was just one of the clearest moments I've ever felt from God of just saying, hey, I need you here. This is where I'm bringing you. And so from there, it just felt like door after door that the Lord was opening up for me. He really provided really phenomenal opportunities. I had been doing speech and debate. And so I kind of had been building these skills of public speaking for a reason that was unknown to me at the time. But then I was getting interview requests, speaking requests. And from there, I just kind of continued on. And I worked for Students for Life for about 7 years.
Okay.
And so last January, I stepped down to be home full time. We're in the process of adopting a 3-year-old little boy. And then I was very pregnant. So it felt like time to be home full time.
Yeah.
And so we had our daughter Augusta in July, and then we're raising our son Genesis. And it's just been a very different season and yet still so pro-life. It's just a core value of our Lord's and something that I think he's calling everyone to, regardless of what that looks like from person to person.
Well, again, I'm so grateful for your time and was curious. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but this is what I, sensing what you're saying. One thing I really like is your heart for pro-life really stems from you walking with Jesus. It's not a politically motivated. Now, obviously, there are more or less political avenues people can take in a pro-life movement, but your heart really was birthed from, hey, this is important to God.
Mm-hmm.
And,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I have conversations with a lot of different people about abortion. When I was working for Students for Life, I did speaking tours on college campuses, and I was talking with a lot of non-Christian people. And what I would always tell them is, you don't have to be a Christian to be pro-life.
Hmm.
I think that as a Christian, you have to be pro-life, if that makes sense, because it's
Sure.
such a core value in scripture of just the sanctity of human life. And I mean, God does not deal lightly with those who shed innocent blood. Like, it is
Mhm.
very clear to him that he protects his people, especially vulnerable people such as children. But it is, for me, like, you could be pro life without being a Christian, because it's kind of both sides. Like, absolutely, it's a Christian value, but it's also completely rooted in science.
You're right.
And I think that's a really important thing for Christians is my faith doesn't tell me that it's a human. Science tells me it's a human. My
Hmm.
faith tells me how I should treat that human.
Hmm.
And so that's how my faith comes into play in this topic, is it's not necessarily that because I'm a Christian, I believe that abortion is wrong. It's it's because it's a human being that I believe abortion is wrong. And so I think for anyone who has kind of had that conversation with people, and maybe you're discounted because you're a Christian in
Right.
this conversation, really important to have those two sides of, no, absolutely I'm pro-life because I'm a Christian.
Mhm.
Absolutely I have that value because I believe in God and what the Bible says. But you also can defend it from purely a scientific stance.
Okay, so let's jump in. I'm going to follow up with you on that because, right, if I'm even with my, non-Christian friends who are going
Mhm.
to lean in directions that I don't, right, one of their first things is going to be, well, when does something actually become living, right?
Mhm.
When is it alive? And the more our imaging technology gets updated, the more we're learning about the fetus and the embryo and what's actually
Mhm.
happening. But you're the expert. I'm not. I graduated from Auburn and grew up in Alabama. We don't know a lot about anything. But in those conversations, if we just go the science route for a minute,
Mhm.
what are some of the things you're tethering yourself to as really important in those moments?
Yeah. The first thing is just starting from the beginning, and that is that life begins at conception. And they can argue with you all day long, but you're going to be able to prove that, and they're not going to be able to disprove it. So if you Google right now, when does life begin? It's going to say fertilization. Princeton, Harvard, they all have published like textbooks that say life begins at fertilization. There's also a study out of the University of Chicago that says 97% of scientists agree life begins at conception. So that is not a very contested point. What
Sure.
is contested is whether or not that life has value. So
Mm,
when they say it's not a life, it's not a human being, you can say, well, that actually is not a scientific stance. The scientific stance would be to say that life begins at conception.
yeah.
And so from there, you just have to have the conversation of they're trying to separate personhood from being a human.
Yep.
And that has never worked well for us in all of history. Anytime we've tried to separate people from humans, that has never turned out well.
Correct.
But the other thing is, I always start with that and then start asking them questions. So here's what I believe. I can prove what I believe, but I want to know more about what you believe. And so I typically will ask somebody, when do you think that life begins?
Okay.
And then it's just a little slippery slope all the way back to conception, because every other stance or belief is inconsistent and unprovable. So if they were to say something like, well, I don't believe it's a human being until birth,
Mm,
my first question would be, okay, then what is the difference between birth and 5 minutes before birth? What
mhm,
happens in that birth canal that makes it a human being? Most of them haven't thought about it like that. And they'll say, well, okay, fine. I think 5 minutes before birth is the same thing. And then you just keep going down the line. Okay, what's the difference between 5 minutes and a week? Really, what happens in there that's
mhm,
changing your mind, that's making you believe it's more of a human at that point than that point? A lot of people will take common markers like viability or heartbeat or fetal pain, and again, you just keep having that conversation. And I always compare it to a non fetus. So when someone says, well, I believe that life begins at viability, I would say, okay, well, what if somebody was fully viable, riding their bike, and then a car comes and hits them and they end up in the hospital on life support?
mm.
They're not on their own able to support their life. They're on life support. Would you say that person is not a human being? Well, of course not. Okay,
Right.
so viability does not always determine whether or not you are a person of value. And so you can just kind of continue to compare
Sure.
it to non-fetus situations just to kind of help them understand that, that little marker isn't consistent. And when a person is always consistent, right?
So let me ask you this, because here's this is not I affirm everything you're saying, but what about somebody who would then respond to this? Okay, well, I believe once the umbilical cord is severed, and they no longer rely, right, on being attached to their mother, and that is the moment in which they become human, for lack of a better word. What's your response to that pushback?
I would say that they're still reliant on their mom. This idea that, a baby is reliant on me, and so therefore I have the right to kill it. You could make the same argument about my 7-month-old daughter. Like, she is 100% reliant on me
Sure.
to survive. But no one would say it'd be morally right for me to decide, you know what? I want some bodily autonomy. I'm not going to feed you anymore. I'm
Mm,
not going to put you to bed. I'm not going to change your diaper. I'm not going to clothe you because you're taking away from me. And that's a violation of my bodily autonomy. If I were to make that decision, I would actually go to jail for child neglect and abuse to
sure.
completely stop taking care of my child. And so we have to understand that that's part of the mother to child relationship, is that the babies need you. But just because something is vulnerable and requires assistance or help from you to survive doesn't mean that you have a right to kill it.
That's right. Well, and you're going to be so much more familiar. You may remember who said it, but I remember years and years ago, I think Matt Chandler quoted this, the pastor at the Village, in a sermon. But there was a lady, and I thought it was a very horrific but honest admission, where it
Mhm.
was essentially, of course, life begins at conception. That's not the argument. The argument really is some people deserve to live more than others. And we
Mhm.
basically get to determine that, there are other people in human history that have had that thought that we are absolutely appalled by.
Yep.
Why is it, in your opinion, that our culture can stomach that kind of idea as it
Mhm.
relates to unborn babies, but would not stomach that idea in any other realm of human history?
Part of me thinks it's just because they can get away with it, and it might
Mm,
be a little bit of a window into just how selfish the human heart can be. And if that's normalized in our culture, that everyone would probably just be like, okay, great. Yeah. I mean, there's so many things that Christians would disagree with how other people live. And I think one of those things is that as a Christian, I understand that part of my existence will include suffering and difficult
mm,
things, and that I don't exist just for myself.
sure,
And that, I think, is one of the biggest difference between a Christian core value and secular values, is
absolutely.
that I don't think I only exist for myself. And so when my children need me, I could make myself the victim of that. And of course, being a mom is really hard. And it's been one of the most humbling things I've ever experienced. Like, adopting a 2.5-year-old and having a baby at the same time was incredibly difficult. And there were days where I felt drained and exhausted. And I could have made myself the victim of that, of woe is me.
Sure.
Nothing is for myself. I don't get to be free. I actually felt like I had less bodily autonomy after I had my baby than
Oh, of
before.
course
When
you
I
do.
was pregnant,
Yeah,
I could go do whatever I wanted. With a baby, that's like you have to hold them or feed them. But I think for me, I'm able to say, these are my children. Of course, they need me. And what an honor is it to be needed by my children?
well, and I think too, I think 1 Corinthians 14 ish, maybe 15 coming to mind, where Paul clearly says you've been bought at a price. You are not your own.
Mm-hmm.
Honor God with your body.
Mm-hmm.
It, it's it's pretty frustrating to have a conversation with a professing Christian that would try to take a stance outside of that. But if I were to let's take God's word, and if I were to set it over here on the shelf, and we're just talking to a secular, westernized American,
Yep.
how do you respond to the idea of, well, my body, my rights?
Mm-hmm.
Right there. What are some other angles you take on that conversation to help people say, hey, we don't actually take that stance consistently, right?
Mm-hmm.
We actually want other people to do things for us,
Yeah.
right? Even where we're secular or not. So what would your take on that or response to that kind of thinking be?
I would just say that the bottom line is that it's not your body. And that's why
Mm.
this is an entire conversation, is this idea of my body, my choice, or whatnot. Oftentimes, the way they're trying to use that is, okay, it's my body, and so now I get to hurt somebody else. That's not what my body, my choice means. I don't have the right to take my fist and go out into the street and punch somebody in the face. We live in a society with rules. And typically, in our society, everyone abides by the fact that your rights end when another human being begins. And so you can do whatever you want with your own body. You can choose to get married. You can choose to run up and down the street skipping. You can choose to get a haircut. You can choose to get tattoos and piercings. You can choose to take certain medication. But when it then affects your baby, that's where your decision ends. And, there's actually laws about what women are allowed to do when they're pregnant. There's certain
Right.
medications that have been outlawed because they were proven to cause birth defects. And so I would say that this idea that it's your body is the issue and where we disagree, because it's not your body. It's a separate human being. And so in the same way that you could not harm another person with your body, that's why we are saying that abortion is wrong, is because you're using your body to end the life of another human being.
Okay, so someone, which is a great response, to someone that's devoted, from time you were 16 until now, really in a profoundly singular direction in this pro-life movement, what have been some of the most discouraging kind of moments you've had in it? And then what have been some sort of cracks of light creeping in where you feel like God really is shifting some things as it relates to this particular area?
Pretty recently, you never know with people on the internet. There's trolls, there's people that are just trying to be annoying. And so I try to use my discretion. I have a Instagram where I share a lot of pro-life apologetics and just kind of what's going on and how do we respond to our culture. And I posted something, and it was about Christians, about how Christians need to be pro-life. And this girl commented that was kind of disagreeing with me. And so I just really quickly responded to her comment on. And then she DM'd me later, and she said something along the lines of, I'm a Christian and I've felt like I might be on the wrong side here for a while.
Hmm.
And so I commented on your page and I immediately prayed that if the Lord wanted me to change my heart on this, that you would respond to me.
Oh my word.
And so she and I went back and forth, and she asked a bunch of questions, and I gave her some resources and just, prayed for her and told her that she's always welcome to message me back. But I think sometimes we get caught up in the controversy and the division that we forget that there's a lot of people out there that are still trying to decide. When we come into this sphere, we assume there's pro-life people and there's pro-choice people.
Sure.
But I think we forget that there's a lot of people in the middle. And it's easy to kind of label everyone as people who disagree with you and people who are wrong. And if we approach them in that way, we're not going to be as appealing to them. And we're probably not going to be able to change people's minds on this. And so some of those little glimmers of hopes have been moments like that, where I just see the Lord kind of using me or other pro-life advocates to bring awareness to this topic in a way that makes people rethink where they stand on it. I think always the discouraging part would be in the political realm. It feels like it's always an uphill battle. We've been promised by different politicians of what they're going to do and how they're going to protect life and how they're going to defund Planned Parenthood. And while we have seen major victories like overturning Roe v. Wade, we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
And at times that can just feel a little bit
daunting, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the encouraging thing even in that is that we are seeing progress. We are seeing change. I don't think a lot of people assumed we'd be able to overturn Roe v. Wade, which stood in place for almost 50 years.
Yeah.
And so in that, my encouragement is just, we don't know the timeline, but we know that God is winning and life will triumph over death.
Hey, what's it like? I obviously can't answer this. What's it like for young girls growing up in, we'll just say America, popular culture, American society, and the messaging, at least around abstinence or pregnancy, abortion, because we've got a lot of ladies discipling younger ladies. We've got a lot of dads, right? I mean, my daughter is, still fairly young, but we got a lot of dads and kind of going, we're probably not even aware to the degree to which this messaging that you ran into in Teen Vogue, I have to assume is exponentially broader and more pervasive now than it was when even you were 16, unless you would say I'm wrong in that.
No, unfortunately, you aren't. And I would say the organization leading a lot of that scary messaging is Planned Parenthood. They are in schools teaching sex ed. They are running ads on your kids' Instagram and Snapchat. And it's not just, I don't even know how to put it. It's predatory in a lot of
Mm,
ways. When they're in schools, it's such a conflict of interest because they're teaching your children about sex. They're trying to normalize it. They're encouraging it, saying, if this is what you want to do, this is your decision. It's your body. You should have the freedom and the right to make this decision for yourself. And we're going to help you. We'll get you on birth control. We'll
mm,
help you with contraceptives. And then you know what? If you get pregnant, you don't need to be scared of your conservative parents. You
mm,
can come to us. We won't tell anyone. We're your friends. We can help you out. And there's a lot of girls that are Christian that find themselves in a circumstance with an unplanned pregnancy. And I think within the church, it's such a hard thing where we want to promote abstinence. We want to protect the sanctity of marriage and sex, but we also want to make ourselves a space to where if our young girls are getting pregnant, they
mm.
feel safe enough to come to us. And it's this hard balance where we don't want to overly demonize it, but we also want to not encourage it. But
Right.
I do think we need to be very aware that young girls in the church are getting pregnant. And
Mm,
how can we create a space to where they feel comfortable to come to us? Because if not, they're going to Planned Parenthood and they're
mm,
making a decision out of fear and shame that will last their entire life.
mm,
So, one thing that my mom did was always, hey, of course, we want you to wait until marriage. But if you ever get pregnant unexpectedly, please come to me. We will not
mm,
be mad. We will support you. We will talk through it. We'll figure it out. And I
mm.
think even just verbalizing that to your teens, even if you think it's unnecessary, I was
Sure.
homeschooled, I was sheltered, I was in speech and debate, but just saying those words for the what if, I think
Mm,
can create a safe enough space to where your child feels comfortable to come to you, because Planned Parenthood is trying to make them think that your parents will be furious, mad, and if you get an abortion, no one will find out. And in a lot of states, we don't have parental notification or even parental, like you don't have to tell the parents.
sure. Right.
You don't even have to notify them, let alone get permission. And so in Washington State, a 14-year-old girl can't take a Tylenol at school without permission from her parents, but she could go to Planned Parenthood and she could get an abortion.
Oh my word.
Never have to find out. And so I think those laws are really, really scary, and it makes us need to be very aware and very communicative with our teens. But then also just I think having these conversations probably at a younger age than you think is
Mm,
really important. I think
okay.
a lot of parents want to protect their kids from the scariness of the world and abortion, but the reality is that kids are catching on. I think the biggest eye-opening moment for me was I actually was teaching at a youth group. They had me come out and do a little pro-life talk, and I spoke to the high schoolers and the middle schoolers, but they were on different nights.
Okay.
So I spoke to the middle schoolers first, and I spoke for about 20 minutes, and all eyes were on me. They were so zoned in. They had so many questions. They were just appalled and shocked. And of course, you kind of tailor it to age appropriate, but I was still very honest about what's happening. And when I said, are there any questions? Like tons of arms rose up. One kid raised his hand. He was like, how is this legal? They were just appalled.
Yeah.
So, because it's the innocence of a child when they hear what abortion is in an honest light, they're
Mm,
shocked. It's not until culture, Planned Parenthood, rephrases it, they use smoke and mirrors, and they desensitize children to believe that abortion is anything else other than
mm,
horrific. The next night I spoke to the high schoolers. Eyes were rolling at me. Everyone was texting on their phones. And
mm,
the questions were not questions, they were arguments.
mm.
It was the same church, and it was the difference between middle school and high school.
That's
And
fascinating.
the problem was the pro-choice narrative had already gotten to the high schoolers. It hadn't gotten to the middle schoolers yet. And so when I can always tell when a kid has already heard it from the other side because their wheels don't turn the same way. And
Mm,
so I think really starting young, like even with my toddler, right? we have conversations about how precious he is, how God made him, how his life has so much value, and we love him not because he's a good boy, but because he's in the image of God
Mhm.
and he's a precious creation. You know,
Sure.
you start that young, and as they get older, you just adapt it to when they're older and older. You know, my nephew, my sister was driving with him. He's 8, and there was some pro-life billboards, and he, was just wondering what was going on. He asked, "What does that mean, Mom?" And she said, "Oh,
Mm.
well, those are pro-life billboards because, abortion happens, and that's when a mom is pregnant and she decides to have an abortion, which is ending the life of that baby, and it's something that we don't believe in as Christians, and your aunt fights against it. That's what she does for work." And he just goes, "Well, Mom, why can't they just wait until the baby is big enough to take it out and then give it to somebody who wants it?" Like
Mm.
his little brain was just like,
Sure.
"Guys, there's a solution to this." And again, I think it's just evidence of the innocence of a child of,
Mm.
not normal for humans to be pro-abortion. It's not.
Well, no, and look, we could discuss like their philosophical approaches. Obviously, we had biblical and theological ones, but you
Mhm.
can't get away from a demonic spiritual reality
Right.
behind such a dark part of our culture, right?
Right. Yeah.
Um, what? Okay, so I told you 30 minutes. We'll get you out of here in just a few moments. But let me ask you. I got a couple more things. One would be right. So age old popular pushback. I don't think good, but popular. Okay, well, what if a woman was the victim of a crime?
Mhm.
This was not even a consensual
Right.
unplanned pregnancy. This was now, granted, we don't really make any rules and laws based off outlying
Mhm.
scenarios in most of what we do, but how do you, where there's a genuine compassionate response that needs to go in that direction because what happened was horrific.
Mhm.
But how do you engage that specific type of scenario?
Yeah. The first thing that I would say is that in this circumstance, our first priority should be care for the woman who's been a victim of sexual assault or a crime, and so it's making sure that she has resources.
Hmm.
And a lot of pregnancy resource centers actually have healing programs. They have counselors that are very well versed in that topic and able to really walk somebody through that. But in terms of whether or not an abortion is moral in that
Right,
circumstance,
right.
I would say the first thing is that we're neglecting the fact that abortion is traumatic. And so in
Mm.
this circumstance, we take something that is devastating down to its
Oh, that's
core,
right.
horrific, and then we're adding more pain and trauma on top of it as a way
Mm.
to try to alleviate that pain. That's not going to work.
Well, and I'm going to interrupt you. That's such a great point because it's kind of presented as a way to improve.
To undo what has happened.
That's right.
And so what I would always say is that abortion does not undo the trauma of rape. It adds to it.
Mm.
And so it might at face value seem like a more compassionate route, but it is not. There's a whole movement of women who are post-abortive, who said, well, whether they chose abortion because they were young or because they were coerced into it, it's something that they live with and regret every day of their lives. And if they
Mm.
could go back and undo that, it's a temporary fix that's
Mm.
going to cause a lifetime of regret. And many women, they don't feel regret until years later, decades later. I've talked to
Sure.
women who said, I was pro-choice, I was fine with my decision. It wasn't until 20 years later when X, Y, and Z happened in my life, and the first thing I thought about was that baby that I
Mm.
aborted. And it's a pain that is just hard to carry.
Yeah.
And so I would say that, first of all, it doesn't undo that trauma. But then the other thing is we have to think of who is who are the victims in this, right? Of course, the woman who's been assaulted is a survivor and a victim, but then you're taking a circumstance that has one victim and you're creating two. And so
Mm.
you're kind of making the baby pay for the sins of their father, which is also wrong. And
Sure.
so it's such a hard circumstance because it
Very. Yeah.
feels so uncompassionate to tell a woman that she would have to carry this life. But I've also talked to a lot of women, and there are studies on this of women who have been assaulted. People who choose life actually report that it was an incredibly healing
Mm.
thing for them
Which is the
to,
opposite narrative we're told, right?
right, but to go through something so horrific and traumatizing, But then to see your child that you love and see something so beautiful come out of something so devastating was actually really healing for them.
Mm,
Whereas the women who chose abortion often report much higher rates of anxiety, depression, suicide, etc. Because abortion, it it's bad for women. It harms women, both in a
mm,
physical sense and an emotional and a spiritual sense. Is that a lot of times there are physical repercussions of abortions, but there's usually, and I would argue almost always, emotional repercussions for abortion. If you look at women who
sure.
have had abortions, they have incredibly higher rates of anxiety and depression and suicide and
Mm,
mental illness. And that is something that our culture is not focusing on at all. They like to pretend that you can get an abortion and you go live your life. You go back to school, you go back to your career. That's not what happens. These women
mhm,
are carrying that, and then they're being neglected because they have created this culture that you have to be so pro abortion that you can't say anything bad about abortion.
mm,
Well, then what about the women who have had abortion and regret it, or had abortion and then struggle? They're ignored.
yeah.
Not only are you suffering in that way, you're then being ignored, and your story is completely silenced because you give a bad name to abortion. Well, abortion already has a bad name. We don't
Mm,
need to be protecting the name of abortion. We need to be making sure that these women have resources, that these women have a place to go. And those women are always ignored in the pro choice sphere.
mhm. That's such good insight. What are, as we wind down, two things. One, I want you to tell people where they could find you and keep kind of getting resourced with what you put out. And then
Mhm.
secondly, what are some other resources, or maybe they're books or kids' books or whatever, so that parents or can start having these type of conversations from a biblical and theological lens with the
Yeah.
kiddos?
The first where you can find me is just at Autumn Higashi on most social media, X, Instagram, TikTok. And then in terms of, where to go from here and how do we kind of build up our children to be pro-life, I would say first, really get plugged in with pro-life organizations, follow them on Instagram, because just constantly hearing that narrative will make you feel more comfortable with having the conversation. The more you hear a response to an argument, by the 10th time, you're going to feel ready to tackle that liberal cousin at Thanksgiving next year. And so I think just continuing to be educated. If you have questions, just dive into them. And I guarantee you, with knowledge comes confidence, and you'll feel ready to have these really important conversations. So organizations like Live Action and Students for Life and Susan B. Anthony List, they're a great place. They do a lot of polls and a lot of research.
Okay.
The book that comes to mind is actually, it's called Pro-Choice versus Pro-Life, or Pro-Life versus Pro-Choice, by Randy Alcorn. And he kind of has it's not a very big book. It's a really great resource to kind of get you going and start thinking through some of those conversations. And I'd say that's a great way to start. If you're just pro-life, you feel confident, you know why you're pro-life, but you're needing a little bit more assistance on how to have
Yeah.
those conversations, I think that's a great book to have in your home.
Well, I'm so thankful for the work you're doing and for joining us, adding your voice to the Downline community. It's been a ton of fun. So I just appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode of the Downline podcast. Please subscribe and go down and rate us and give us 5 stars. Help us get this content out to as many people as possible, as we hope to continue to equip men and women to join the Great Commission as we make disciples for a lifestyle as a lifetime.